We begin with the federal government's official response to this year's report on sexual misconduct in the military. Defence Minister Anita Anand is accepting all of its recommendations. That includes a review of Canada's military colleges. But the former Supreme Court Justice who made those recommendations doesn't appear fully satisfied.
I find that all the reviews that are being suggested in the minister's response are for the most part internal and therefore misses entirely the central point of my report, which is the need for CAF to open up to a lot more external, not only scrutiny, but input.
For more on the government's plan for the military, I'm joined by Anita Anand, the Minister of National Defence. Minister Anand, I'd like to start with the big picture if I could. You say you won't reject any of Madame Arbour's recommendations, but does that mean you'll fulfill all of them 100%?
It is my intention to ensure that all of those recommendations are implemented. Indeed, we have already begun to implement them, as I indicated in May 2022 when I accepted the report and welcomed the report from Madame Arbour. We've already begun to implement those recommendations, whether it is in terms of the promotion of general and flag officers, whether it is in terms of diversity and inclusion training in the military colleges, whether it is in terms of increasing the robustness of the Sexual Misconduct Response Centre. We are full steam ahead to ensure that cultural change in the Canadian Armed Forces occurs. And today was a good day because we implemented the roadmap forward for the implementation of all 48 recommendations in the House of Commons. And that is different from previous reports in that we've responded to each and every recommendation, and we will continue to provide updates to the Canadian public quarterly to ensure that there's full accountability going forward.
Well, I wonder if I could get your response to something that Louise Arbour said today when she said that about that roadmap, which includes a number of reviews. She said, I find that all the reviews that are being suggested in the minister's response are for the most part internal and therefore misses entirely the central point of my report, which is the need for the armed forces to open up to a lot more external, not only scrutiny, but input. What's your reaction to what Ms. Arbour had to say?
So first of all, I thank Madame Arbour for the extensive work that she has done on behalf of the armed forces and our country in terms of delivering the report and the recommendations. And in terms of her statement that you just mentioned, I also want to reiterate that our intention is to move forward as quickly as possible on all of these recommendations. And in fact, Madame Arbour suggested the appointment of an external monitor, and I did just that, appoint an external monitor, Madame Jocelyn Tarnian. I appointed her in October, and her role, as specified in the Arbour report, is to oversee the implementation of the recommendations. And she herself will also be delivering reports to the Canadian public so that they have insight into the accountability and the process of implementation. So very much we are opening up the process, and very much we are moving full steam ahead on implementation of the recommendations.
Minister, how do you square that with misses entirely the central point? Because when someone like Louise Arbour makes a comment like that, it catches your attention. So I mean, what do you make of the fact that she's saying that some of the options you've chosen here misses the central point of what she was recommending?
I will say that we have been working for months and months since May 30th when we welcomed her final report, and the fact that we are able to put forward a detailed plan for implementing each of the 48 recommendations, some of which have already been implemented today, is an historic moment for us in terms of cultural change in the Canadian Armed Forces. But let's just take a step back, David, and understand that what we are trying to do is not only implement those 48 recommendations, but we need to lay the foundations for broader cultural change in the Canadian Armed Forces. Why is that so important? It's important for moral reasons, as you can imagine, but also for operational reasons. We are at a pivotal moment in the Canadian Armed Forces. We need to grow this institution, and in order to attract members to the Canadian Armed Forces, they need to understand and feel comfortable that this is an institution where they will be respected, where they will be protected when they put on a uniform in service of this country.
Okay, I want to ask about the transfer of sexual assault cases to civilian police and civilian courts, which is a central recommendation to all of this. You note some success, but there's also been some obstacles and roadblocks, some 40 cases, I believe it is, civilian prosecution agencies have refused to take on, and there is some resistance to civilian police and civilian prosecutors taking this on. So how do you overcome that? How do you finalize this full transfer of authority for investigating these cases from the military to civilian police forces?
So let's just be clear. Recommendation number 5 says that all cases should be prosecuted in the civilian justice system, and there should be one system alone. While we are working to implement recommendation number 5, we are moving forward with Madame Arbour's interim recommendation, which says that case transfer, as you mentioned in your question, should continue to occur. And I want to say, in terms of the transfer of cases, we have seen receptiveness from the RCMP and from the province of Quebec to accept these cases, and indeed that transfer is going very well. In terms of other challenges, we are establishing our federal, provincial, and territorial table with officials to ensure that the process is smooth and that the transfer of cases can occur in a systematic way. And so that process will continue to occur in the very short term. It's happening right now while we work on the full-fledged implementation of recommendation number 5.
But does that mean money? You need to come up with some sort of a funding arrangement? Because I've heard capacity challenges in terms of taking this off, which I know is something Madame Arbour has said is maybe a little bit overstated. But is it just going to take cash to the provinces and the territories to make this happen?
There are issues that the provinces and territories have and will continue to bring forward, and that's the reason why I asked for this table to be established, so there is a forum for the collaboration and cooperation that we are seeing, generally speaking. In addition, these conversations have already begun. I am speaking regularly with my counterparts and are corresponding with ministers at the provincial level to ensure that the collaboration is there, because we all want what is in the best interests of victims and survivors, and that's what we will continue to work on.
You mentioned changing the culture. The entry point for a lot of people is through the military college system in this country, and Justice Arbour recommended a review to decide whether things like the Royal Military College should be scrapped outright because of well-documented history of sexual misconduct and other challenges there. You said today, in setting up the terms of reference for the review board to look at this, that you're confident the colleges will meet the challenge. Does that mean at this point you're inclined to keep the colleges and reform them, or are you still willing to consider just eliminating them if that's what it takes?
So to be clear, Madame Arbour requested and recommended a study of the colleges, and that's exactly what we are implementing to ensure that we are fulfilling the terms of that recommendation. And in advance of that study occurring, it would not be prudent for me to presuppose the outcome of that study. We want to make sure that the review board is well equipped and staffed, and we will make sure that the resources are there for that review to occur. And once that review comes in, then that will be the time for decisions to occur. But it would not be a good idea to presuppose the outcome of that study at this juncture.
This is a pretty central one, though, right? I wonder if you have a sense of the timeline for that review. I mean, there's a Christmas tree behind you, so we're near the end of 2022. Obviously, it won't start till next year, but will it be concluded in 2023? Do you hope to have it done within the next year, or where are you on that?
Aussitôt que possible, as soon as possible, David. But let me just reiterate what has happened in 2022. We received the final report of Madame Arbour on May 30th, 2022. I appointed Jocelyn Terrien in October 2022, and I'm coming back on December 13th, 2022 to lay out a full-fledged roadmap on 48 recommendations. That's the type of work we are doing at National Defence to ensure that cultural change in the Canadian Armed Forces continues apace, and we will continue to come back and provide transparency and accountability in terms of our progress and all of the recommendations, not only recommendation number 29.
Right, and just a final point on that. You talked about the external reviewer that is in place, and I think there will be regular reporting on progress.
Exactly.
Do you have a big picture timeline, though? I appreciate 48 recommendations take a long time to implement, some of them longer than others. Have you got a sense of like a point in the horizon where you hope to have these 48 reviewed, addressed, and implemented?
I want to say, David, that that would not be prudent. If you take a look at the 48 recommendations and the breadth of what is being requested from Madame Arbour, the most important thing is that we waste no time in implementation. And that's exactly the fortitude that I am bringing to the table in implementing those 48 recommendations. And to step back, cultural change in the Canadian Armed Forces is going to take months and years. We need to ensure that that cultural change occurs from the ground up. Every single person in the armed forces and the broader defense team needs to take on board the importance of diversity, inclusion, non-discrimination, no sexual harassment, no sexual misconduct. Those are the goals we are striving towards. They are the most important centerpiece of reconstituting the Canadian Armed Forces so that it is robust and stands the test of time, so that it continue to support and protect our great country.
Okay, Minister Anita Anand, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Take good care.
Okay, so opposition MPs were listening into my interview with the Defence Minister there and are here to respond. Shelby Kramp-Neuman is the Conservative Associate Defence Critic, and Lindsay Mathyssen is the Defence Critic for the NDP. Thank you both for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
Ms. Kramp-Neuman, I'd like to start with you. You've heard the Minister there. They've accepted the recommendations. They've laid out the roadmap. Is this roadmap acceptable to you?
Yeah, well, it's a pivotal roadmap, and I think it's one that we need to take extremely carefully. It's a roadmap that has to deal with a lot of issues, and I certainly appreciate and we welcome the roadmap. I think it's very important. But what my concern is why it has taken as long as it has. It's been years. There's been years of allegation. There's been years of misconduct. There's been countless incidents where this should have been implemented years ago. Back in 2014, there was an opportunity. This is more like a review of a review. So I'm thrilled that we're moving forward, but how long is it going to take us to get from this to actually action?
Lindsay Mathyssen, to hammer the roadmap analogy all the way, does this get us to where we need to go, do you think? Does the path laid out in the response today take the Canadian Armed Forces to a point where we can move past some of the controversy and be proud of it?
You know, I think that there's a lot of hope that we'll be able to get to a point where servicemen and women can truly serve equally, where they don't have to worry about that misogyny, that sexual misconduct. But there's also a lot of skepticism because exactly as Ms. Kramp-Neuman said, this is one report based on a few others. And I said that specifically and asked Justice Arbour, you know, so many of your recommendations are based on the Deschamps report, on the Fish report, on, we've seen a few Auditor General reports. I was on a Status of Women committee trying to get through a lot of this. And the government has consistently said the right things, but that action is lacking. And ultimately, that's what women and servicemen, they need right now.
Right. And so Shelby Kramp-Neuman, to build on that, I mean, the past reports have not been acted on. They've sat there. But this time, there is a written documented response on how they're going to respond to all 48 recommendations, at least in some detail. A process is outlined there with an external monitor and some scaffolding around it to provide some accountability. So does that give you comfort that there at least is this oversight, transparency, and accountability component that's been missing in the past?
Well, consultations and conversations don't help victims. I'm concerned that it's taken so long. If 48 recommendations is very ambitious, albeit we're certainly appreciative that they're making these next steps, it's how long is it going to take to get to the next step? There's some of these recommendations that don't have to sit on a shelf for the next 7 years or 7 months. Recommendations such as recommendation number 5, this is something with regards to the civilian court. This could be done within a week, 2 weeks' time. This is not something that has to...
Well, they have started transferring some cases, right? It's not completely done.
Right. So my concern is what's the delay? Is it the Minister of Justice? Is it the Minister of Defense? Or is it just pure political will?
Or could it be the provinces? Or, I mean, Sometimes things don't go that smooth between the federal government and the provincial government. I don't need to tell you that.
Fair enough.
But I mean, you do have to get buy-in, right, at the civilian level of responsibility for this. I would assume that needs to be hammered out.
No, there's certainly a buy-in that needs to happen. But with regards to culture, culture is not something that can be changed overnight. This has been something that has been happening for years and years and years. Right now, with regards to recruitment and retention, a third of the armed forces are not content in their role. So the culture, 34% of them are not happy with the culture in our Canadian Armed Forces. So something has to change, and it has to change quickly, because we have a defenseless country if we don't continue to act and put some actual grit behind the talk.
So, Lindsay Mathyssen, I know your party issued a statement with similar frustration to the slow pace of change, the inadequate response, to use a generous word perhaps, to past reports like this. Do you take comfort in the process of accountability and reporting that the minister has outlined and baked into this response this time?
I am extremely worried, as was Justice Arbour. And you had the clip that she believes that with all of these internal studies, these internal mechanisms that are outlined by the response from the minister, that they've missed the point entirely. And that's a huge concern. In terms of the external monitor, I have said as well that we will ensure that as the opposition, we will check up and make sure that they are doing their job, that they haven't put any timelines in a lot of these recommendations or responses, but that things are moving forward. But the external monitor herself responds to the minister directly, and this was part of the huge problem that we saw with Vance and the Ombudsman. So we need to see some significant change, and yes, I'm very concerned and I'm very skeptical, and I'm worried that the women specifically that I heard in Status of Women that came forward over a year ago, that they won't get the answers that they need, and they need to get those answers.
I wonder on one of the recommendations from Madame Arbour to review the military colleges and possibly get rid of the military colleges and send, officers and recruits to civilian universities as an entry point there. Would be a big thing to disband military colleges and dismantle those institutions. I wonder, Shelby Kramp-Neuman, if you have any thoughts on the fact that they're setting up a review board to look at this, and who knows where it goes.
Well, I think that we certainly take great pride in those institutions, and I think that we really need to focus on the culture that is at an all-time low. Lindsay spoke about that, of the women that we need, that they're encouraging to get more involved. This is something that was in the initial recommendation back in 2014. So this is not new, albeit it's something that is important. These are recommendations that have been in place for years and not acted upon.
Lindsay Mathyssen, could you fathom the dismantling of the two major military colleges in the country? Is that something that you should consider, or should it be reform?
Justice Arbour, I think, was right, and I can agree with the minister that we need to see that review take place. But the biggest part of this point is that that external review has to happen. That all of these institutions, and they can be civilian as well, there are issues of sexual misconduct, of misogyny, of harassment that exist, and specifically with these colleges, universities, it's that external review, that letting in of the light, right, to be the true disinfectant, that has to happen. And so that review is really key and a part of that, but I really appreciate that Justice Arbour really focused on that, because those are the leaders that will come into the military to ideally change how things happen.
That's where the change will happen, right?
Yeah.
But I wonder, you expressed some frustration with the slow response up to now, and some skepticism with this government for now, but what would you like to see, Shelby Kramp-Neuman, in the new year, early in the new year, that would show that Minister Anand is true to her word and she's serious on implementing these reforms?
Well, I think that actions speak significantly louder than words, and I think as opposition, it is incumbent of us to hold them to account in a respectful manner. I certainly would acknowledge that during committee today, she did say that she'll report back timely to committee, so we'll certainly hold her to account with that and acknowledge that that's the appropriate thing to do. But again, it's words are easy, actions are significantly harder.
Lindsay Mathyssen, same question to you. I mean, what action, I mean, to move past the word stage, what action do you want to see done by, say, January, February, March to show that they really are moving at a quick pace on these 48 recommendations?
So I think that one of the key things can be the legislation that needs to be brought forward, some significant changes, working with opposition parties too to review a lot of those changes within the National Defence Act. I think that some of the funds or the resources that need to be allocated to reformation within, that can certainly happen. There are key things though that Arbour directly asked for, the abolishment of the duty to report. That was so clear. And so I think that these are steps that can be taken, that the response doesn't lay out adequately enough. And so we all need to take a lot of time with this to make sure that we get it right. But there are those immediate things. And certainly, as Shelby had mentioned as well, keeping pace, making sure that we hear from the minister regularly, making sure that we hear from the external monitor, and doing our role as the opposition parties to keep that going.
Right. It seems that public reporting, transparency component is going to be vital if this process is going to have credibility.
I really think that Canadians expect more. They're looking for more, continuously hearing from constituents. I have Trenton Air Base nearby my riding, and I visited it, and there's a reoccurring theme that people are not overly content, and they don't feel good about their role. And I'm a very patriotic Canadian, and we should be very proud of our military. And right now, there's a seed of discontent, and we need to act on it.
Okay. Thank you both for coming in. Shelby Kramp-Neuman, Lindsay Mathyssen, thank you very much.